A shocking turn of events. The bustling terminal at Chicago O'Hare was a cacophony of voices, the hum of announcements, and the hurried footsteps of last-minute passengers. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of anticipation as travelers made their way to their designated gates, each person heading toward their destination with excitement or apprehension. Flight 2457, bound for New York City, had its boarding call. It was a full flight, packed with passengers ready for the short but essential journey, some eager to reunite with loved ones, others simply yearning to escape the weight of everyday life. Among the sea of passengers, Captain Amelia Hayes walked with quiet confidence, her head held high, her posture exuding an aura of authority. She wasn't in uniform today. The captain's jacket, which usually fit her like a second skin, was replaced by a light jacket she had picked up just a few hours earlier. Her hands rested lightly on the strap of her purse, and her steps were purposeful as she walked toward the gate. Her eyes briefly scanned the crowd. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about today, except for the fact that, for once, she wasn't at work. She wasn't about to take command of an aircraft, navigate the complexities of the airspace, or manage the safety of her passengers. Today, she was a passenger, just like everyone else. But even as she walked through the terminal, there was something different about the way she carried herself. Amelia Hayes was one of the few black female pilots in the aviation world, and in her career, she had faced countless challenges. From the subtle biases that appeared in the cockpit to the overt prejudice she sometimes encountered when meeting with her colleagues, Amelia had spent years proving herself. Despite the systemic barriers, she had earned the title of captain, a title that didn't come easy, especially for women of color in a traditionally male-dominated profession. The fact that she had made it to this point was a testament to her perseverance, her intelligence, and her unwavering belief that she belonged in the skies. However, today wasn't about proving anything. Today, it was about enjoying a rare moment of relaxation. A day off. A chance to travel to New York City and reconnect with her family. Amelia approached the gate, her thoughts drifting momentarily to her upcoming visit. It had been months since she had last seen her parents, and her younger brother had just gotten engaged. The thought of spending time with them filled her with a warmth she hadn't realized she missed so much. After all, her life as a pilot had kept her away from home for longer stretches than she liked to admit. The constant schedule, the unpredictable weather, the time zone changes, it was all part of the job she loved, but sometimes, it felt like her personal life had been put on hold. She had managed to secure a first-class seat for this flight, a luxury she didn't often indulge in. It was something she had decided she deserved after years of hard work, long hours, and a career that often demanded more than most could give. First class had always felt like a symbol of comfort, an acknowledgement of one's achievements. As she slid her boarding pass from the folder, the excitement of a peaceful journey filled her heart. She had earned this, she knew it. As she stepped up to the gate counter, she greeted the agent with a calm, friendly smile. The young woman behind the desk smiled back, scanning Amelia's boarding pass with practiced ease. "Thank you, Captain Hayes," the agent said with a smile, handing back the boarding pass. "Your seat is ready for you." "Thank you," Amelia replied, giving the agent a polite nod. She turned to head toward the gate, her eyes scanning the path ahead. The boarding process had already begun, and she was eager to settle into her seat. She had spent so much time in the cockpit, navigating the skies, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be a passenger in an aircraft. There was a sense of anticipation and novelty in the experience, something she had taken for granted. As Amelia walked toward the jetway, a subtle shift in the energy around her caught her attention. It was almost imperceptible, but there was something about the way the other passengers were looking at her, their eyes lingering just a bit too long. Some stared openly, while others pretended not to notice. Amelia, ever aware of how people responded to her presence, could feel the subtle tension building, though she tried to brush it aside. She took a deep breath as she stepped onto the plane, walking down the narrow aisle toward her assigned seat in the first-class section. The plush leather seats, the quiet hum of the cabin, the gentle overhead lighting, all of it was a reminder of the luxury and comfort that came with traveling first class. She passed several passengers in the economy section who didn't seem to give her a second glance, but that didn't concern her. She had become used to people's reactions over the years. People often assumed that because she was black and a woman, she didn't belong in positions of authority, especially in a profession like aviation. But Amelia had learned to ignore the whispers and sideways glances. She had worked too hard to let their ignorance affect her. As she reached her seat, she saw a flight attendant standing beside it, smiling warmly. "Welcome aboard, Captain Hayes," the attendant said, her tone sincere. "Can I help you with your carry-on?" Amelia nodded, grateful for the kindness, and placed her bag in the overhead bin before settling into her seat. The flight attendant handed her a glass of champagne, which she accepted with a quiet nod of thanks. The champagne was chilled to perfection, and she took a small sip, savoring the smooth taste. Her thoughts drifted once more to her family. She could already imagine the joy on her mother's face when they finally reunited. Her mom was always so proud of her, but Amelia had never felt she had enough time to truly explain how much she appreciated her support. Her father, on the other hand, would likely want to hear all about her latest adventures, what challenges she had faced, what lessons she had learned, and what new heights she had reached in her career. She took another sip of champagne, lost in her daydreams, when suddenly, a sharp voice broke through her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am. Could you please step back to the gate?" Amelia turned, startled, and saw the same gate agent from earlier standing in the aisle. Her brow furrowed in confusion. "Is there a problem?" Amelia asked, her tone calm but cautious. The agent hesitated, her eyes shifting nervously between Amelia and the flight attendant. "I'm afraid there's been an issue with your seat," she said, her voice lower now, almost apologetic. "Your seat has been reassigned." Amelia blinked, unsure of what she was hearing. "What do you mean, reassigned?" The agent shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the flight attendant as if seeking confirmation. "It's a mistake, ma'am," the agent stammered. "There's been a system error. We need to move you to a different seat." A cold sensation washed over Amelia. She felt her pulse quicken as she stood up, her body tensing. "A system error? I've paid for a first-class ticket. You can't just move me to a different seat." The agent's face reddened, and she cast a quick glance down the aisle, where several other passengers were now starting to notice the situation. The flight attendant looked nervously between the agent and Amelia, not saying a word. "I've been assigned to first class," Amelia said, trying to maintain her composure. "This isn't right. I've already checked in, and my seat was confirmed." The agent cleared her throat, but her hesitation only deepened Amelia's suspicion. "Yes, ma'am, but due to the system error, there's no available first-class seat for you. We can reassign you to an economy seat, though." Amelia's eyes narrowed, her mind racing. This was not a typical mistake. She had flown on enough flights to recognize a genuine error versus something more deliberate. The agent's fidgeting, the uneasy glance exchanged between her and the flight attendant, it all felt off. "I'm not going anywhere until you resolve this," Amelia said firmly, her tone unwavering. "I paid for this seat, and I expect to sit in it." The agent seemed flustered, but she nodded slowly. "I'll speak with the supervisor, ma'am. Please wait here." Amelia crossed her arms, standing tall, and as she looked around the cabin, she could sense the growing tension among the other passengers. Some of them were watching curiously, while others exchanged whispers. Amelia's heart pounded, but she kept her expression calm. She wasn't going to let this slide, no matter what. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about respect. It was about the years of effort it took to prove herself in a world that often overlooked her. And she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. The minutes stretched on as she waited, her thoughts swirling in frustration. Finally, the gate agent returned, accompanied by a supervisor. The man was tall, wearing a crisp uniform, but his face was hard to read. "Ma'am, I understand there's a problem with your seat assignment," he said, his voice polite but distant. Amelia stood her ground. "Yes. I've been reassigned to an economy seat when I paid for first class." The supervisor glanced at the agent, who quickly explained the situation. He gave a slight nod, though his expression remained neutral. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but the seat you were assigned to in first class is no longer available. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do. We'll need to move you to economy." Amelia's chest tightened. This wasn't a simple mistake, it felt like a deliberate oversight. She had seen it all too often in her career, and it seemed as though the world was once again testing her resolve. She wasn't about to back down. "I'll be speaking to someone about this," Amelia said firmly, her voice low but filled with authority. "This is unacceptable." The supervisor sighed, clearly growing impatient, but he nodded. "I understand, ma'am. I'll make a note of your concerns, but the seat change stands." Amelia took a slow, deliberate breath. Her mind raced, but she knew one thing: this wasn't the end. It couldn't be, unveiling the truth. Amelia's hands clenched into fists, but she didn't let her emotions dictate her actions. She had been through countless challenges in her career. Sometimes life had a way of testing you, pushing you to the brink of frustration. But she had always risen above it. She had faced adversity head-on, whether in the cockpit or in the real world. Today would not be any different. The slow pulse of tension in the pit of her stomach only fueled her resolve. As the supervisor left her standing in the aisle, his expression distant, Amelia's gaze scanned the cabin. She was aware of the eyes now on her, the passengers who had become silent, watching the unfolding scene with a mixture of curiosity and concern. She could almost hear their thoughts: what's going to happen now? Will she take the economy seat? Why is she being singled out? Amelia had long grown accustomed to such attention, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. The weight of being one of the very few black female pilots in a male-dominated industry was not something anyone could truly understand unless they had lived through it. She had been the subject of scrutiny more times than she could count, but this felt different. This wasn't just about the seat assignment. There was something else going on, something beneath the surface. She turned slowly to look at the other passengers seated in first class, her eyes lingering for just a moment on each of their faces. Some were still half watching the exchange with mild interest, others were openly staring. It was clear that they had noticed the problem. Amelia could see the subtle shift in their demeanor, the way they now avoided her gaze, as if unsure whether they should intervene or stay out of it. A few moments later, Amelia was joined by a tall, older man who had slipped into the aisle with a quiet grace. He wore a navy blue suit, polished shoes that gleamed under the overhead lights, and had the kind of air about him that suggested power and authority. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his face was stern, one of those faces that didn't betray much emotion. It was a face Amelia had seen many times in the corporate world, a face that carried the weight of experience but also, at times, the burden of ignorance. "Captain Hayes?" he asked, his voice firm, but not unkind. His eyes glinted with something that was hard to place, perhaps suspicion, or perhaps something more disconcerting. "I understand there's an issue with your seating assignment." Amelia's spine straightened at the mention of her title. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady, though the simmering frustration was evident. "I was told my first-class seat is unavailable due to a system error, and that I am being reassigned to an economy seat." The man's eyes flickered with something, perhaps surprise, but he quickly masked it with a calm expression. "I see," he said, his voice remaining neutral. "There's a reason for the reassignment. Let me explain." Amelia could feel the hair on the back of her neck standing up, an instinctive awareness that something about the situation was beginning to unravel, something far deeper than a simple seating error. She held her ground. "I don't need an explanation, sir. I need my seat back. I paid for it, and I expect to be seated in it. If there's a mistake, I expect it to be rectified immediately." The man raised a hand slightly, signaling for calm, though his eyes betrayed a glint of condescension. "Captain Hayes, I completely understand your frustration. But there's no mistake. I regret to inform you that your seat was given to another passenger at the gate due to weight and balance regulations. We have a limited number of first-class seats available, and priority must be given to passengers who are more qualified to occupy them." The words hit her like a cold slap across the face. Amelia's mouth went dry as her mind raced to process the underlying meaning in his statement. "More qualified," she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "Are you telling me that I, one of the few black female pilots in the country, am not qualified for a first-class seat?" The man's expression remained unchanged, but the flicker of discomfort that passed through his eyes told Amelia everything she needed to know. "It's not about race, Captain," he said, his words trailing off into something that seemed rehearsed, almost too polished. "It's about seat prioritization. The system doesn't always allow for exceptions, and there was a specific need for the seat you were assigned." Amelia's jaw tightened. The sheer audacity of the statement stunned her. This wasn't just about a seat or system errors. It was about something far more insidious. This was discrimination, masked by a corporate excuse, a justification that no longer held weight in the face of Amelia's sharp mind. For a brief moment, she considered walking away, just taking the economy seat and letting it go. But that wasn't in her nature. She had fought too hard, too long to get to where she was. She wasn't going to let some outdated, institutionalized bias tear down everything she had worked for. Not today. "Sir," she said, her voice now as cold and controlled as steel, "I've flown this route hundreds of times. I've been a captain on this very airline. You can't convince me that this is anything other than what it appears to be. I know what I'm hearing, and I know what I'm experiencing. You have no right to treat me this way." The older man's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the back of the plane, then back at Amelia. For a split second, she saw something shift in his demeanor, a recognition, perhaps, that he couldn't easily dismiss her. And yet, his words came out with a practiced calm. "Captain Hayes, I assure you that we're following protocol here. This is a matter of proper seating arrangement, and your request is unusual. But I will speak to our higher-ups. Perhaps they'll be able to offer a different perspective on this situation." Amelia's patience was wearing thin. "You don't get to hide behind protocol, sir. Not anymore. You have a systemic issue here, and it's something I'm not going to let slide under the rug." She paused, allowing her words to settle. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. Some were now watching with genuine concern, while others exchanged looks of disbelief. She wasn't sure what kind of impact this situation would have, but she knew that it was a fight that could no longer be ignored. The weight of the moment was not lost on her. She had to make this stand. The supervisor sighed and nodded curtly. "If you feel this strongly, then we'll have to escalate the matter. But I'm afraid it will take time, and in the meantime, you'll have to take your new seat in economy." Amelia didn't flinch. "I'll take my seat, but not without you understanding that what you've done today is wrong. And I'll make sure that the appropriate people hear about this. No one, should ever be treated this way, especially not in this day and age." Without waiting for another word, she turned and walked toward the rear of the plane. As she passed through the aisles, the whispers among the passengers grew louder, and Amelia noticed a few of them, some of the first-class passengers, look at her with a mixture of sympathy and, perhaps, guilt. But Amelia wasn't looking for sympathy. She wasn't interested in the pity of those who had done nothing to stop the injustice. Her eyes locked on the economy seats ahead, the place she was now being forced to sit. She had known this moment was coming, had suspected that it was only a matter of time before someone with more power, more influence, decided that she wasn't worthy of the respect she had earned. And now it was happening. But Amelia was not the kind to let these things slide. She sat in the cramped economy seat, her back straight and her expression unwavering. The moment was not over. It had only just begun. And as the aircraft prepared for takeoff, Amelia knew that she wasn't going to let this moment fade into oblivion. She had a story to tell, one that needed to be heard, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been treated as less than, for every person who had faced discrimination or bias in any form. Her seat might have been moved, but Amelia Hayes was just getting started. The fight for justice. The moment the aircraft's engines roared to life, Amelia felt a strange sense of calm. The hum of the engines, the gentle vibrations of the plane beneath her, seemed to pull her back to a familiar place, a place where she had always felt in control, a place that had been her sanctuary for so many years. But this time, as the plane ascended into the sky, she couldn't escape the knot tightening in her stomach. The battle she had unknowingly walked into was far from over, and the lingering feeling of injustice refused to fade. As the seatbelt sign flickered on and the flight attendants made their rounds, Amelia's eyes scanned the cabin. The passengers around her had returned to their own worlds, some dozing off, others lost in their devices. But Amelia couldn't help but notice that a few had turned their attention back to her, quiet whispers, furtive glances. She had become the subject of their unspoken curiosity, the oddity in the room. It wasn't just about the seat now. It had become something larger, something that resonated on a deeply personal level. She was no longer just a black woman who had fought her way to the cockpit. She was a symbol of resistance, of the fight against the undercurrents of inequality that still ran deep in the world. But this fight was different. This wasn't just a personal crusade. This was a fight for every person who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or undermined because of who they were or where they came from. The sting of the unfair treatment she had endured on the ground still lingered, but Amelia wasn't going to let it consume her. The first-class seat was only a small part of the bigger picture. What had happened to her was just a symptom of a larger problem that continued to plague not only the aviation industry but society as a whole. And she wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. Minutes passed, and Amelia remained seated, her thoughts swirling. She felt the weight of the decision she had made earlier in the terminal. She had chosen to stand her ground, to not allow this injustice to simply fade into the background. But as the plane soared above the clouds, a new sense of determination began to take root inside her. She wasn't going to just sit back and let this slide. She wasn't going to let the system continue to justify this kind of treatment. With a sense of quiet resolution, Amelia pulled out her phone and began composing an email to the airline's customer service department. She outlined the incident, detailing every step, from the moment she had presented her boarding pass to the gate agent, to the supervisor's dismissive behavior, and the unjust reassignment of her seat. She didn't mince words, but she also kept her tone calm, professional, focused on the facts, not the emotion that threatened to flood her words. As she typed, she couldn't help but think about all the other people who had likely faced similar discrimination in silence, people who had been told their seat wasn't for them because of their gender, their race, or some other arbitrary reason. She thought about her colleagues in the aviation industry, other black female pilots who had fought their way through the same barriers, who had endured the same frustrations, the same dismissive attitudes. Amelia was no longer just representing herself, she was representing them all. She hit send and leaned back in her seat, her mind still racing. The email wasn't the end of it. It was just the beginning. She had already decided that she would escalate the matter, reach out to the higher-ups in the airline, file a formal complaint, and perhaps even speak to the media. But she knew it would take time, and that the immediate battle wasn't going to be won in the email inbox. The flight attendants moved through the aisles again, offering snacks and drinks. Amelia accepted a glass of water, the cool liquid refreshing her dry throat. She smiled politely at the attendant who served her, but her mind was elsewhere. The calm exterior she projected was a mask, one she had perfected over the years. Inside, however, she was calculating her next steps, figuring out how to make the most impact with her voice. She wasn't going to back down. As the flight continued, Amelia found herself lost in thought. The cabin remained relatively quiet, the gentle hum of the plane a constant reminder of the world outside. The sky was a soft shade of blue, and Amelia could almost forget, for a fleeting moment, the injustice that had taken place. But her thoughts always returned to the same place. What could she do next? How could she ensure that this incident wasn't just a passing story, that it didn't fade into the background as so many others had before? She recalled the faces of the other passengers, the ones who had witnessed the entire exchange. Some had watched her with empathy, others with uncertainty. There had been a few who had looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding. Amelia wasn't sure where they stood, whether they truly understood what had happened, or if they were merely relieved it hadn't been them in her position. But there was one face that had caught her eye, a woman sitting 2 rows ahead in the first-class section, a woman with short dark hair and piercing green eyes. She had watched Amelia's confrontation with the supervisor closely, her gaze not filled with judgment, but with something else, something like understanding. Amelia could tell that this woman, too, had faced her own struggles, her own battles against the forces that sought to keep her from reaching her full potential. Amelia wondered if this woman knew what it felt like to be underestimated, to be questioned based on her identity rather than her abilities. Amelia's curiosity grew as she considered the possibility of speaking to her, of seeking out an ally in this sea of strangers. But she quickly dismissed the idea. There would be time for that later, once the plane had landed and the battle had been won. For now, Amelia needed to focus on what was most important, ensuring that this moment didn't just remain a personal grievance, but a turning point that could lead to real change. Hours passed as the plane continued its journey across the country. The in-flight entertainment began to flicker to life on the screens in front of her, but Amelia ignored it. She wasn't in the mood for distractions. Her focus remained on the situation at hand. She had already thought about the next steps. The customer service department would be her first line of defense, but she had no doubt that it would take more than a few emails to make a real impact. She would need to push harder, fight longer. The airplane began its descent into New York, and the familiar feeling of anticipation returned. Amelia's mind raced through the details of the upcoming family reunion, her parents' faces, her younger brother's excitement, the joy that would come from reconnecting with loved ones after so long. But despite the warmth she felt at the thought of seeing her family, her resolve remained strong. This wasn't just about her family anymore. This was about something larger, something that could affect so many others who had been overlooked, dismissed, or excluded based on their identity. She wasn't going to let this go. As the wheels of the plane touched down on the runway, Amelia stood up, gathering her things with methodical precision. The passengers around her began to move, some rushing to get off the plane, others simply stretching their legs after hours in the air. Amelia didn't rush. She moved with purpose, her mind still locked on the issue at hand. The moment she stepped off this plane, she would begin to fight for the change that was long overdue. She walked down the jetway toward the gate, her thoughts sharp, focused. She had been through much harder battles than this one, but this was different. This was a battle she couldn't ignore. She was determined to make her voice heard, and she knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger conversation that needed to be had, one that would continue long after the plane had landed. The moment Amelia Hayes stepped into the bustling terminal at New York's JFK Airport, she knew that her fight was far from over, the power of a voice. The hum of the bustling JFK airport was a stark contrast to the internal storm Amelia carried with her as she made her way toward the baggage claim. Her mind was still grappling with the frustration of what had happened, being denied the seat she rightfully earned, the systemic inequity she had faced, and the ugly truths she had uncovered. She had known discrimination existed, but it was always different when it happened to you. Amelia's grip on her suitcase handle tightened, her jaw clenched as she walked through the terminal. She needed time to process everything, to gather her thoughts before heading home to her family. The reunion was a welcome distraction, but she knew her fight had just begun. The matter wasn't over with a single email or a single conversation, it would take more than that. She glanced at the flight status boards as she moved, the bright screens flashing in all directions with departure times, destinations, and flight numbers. The thought of her journey home, the much-needed respite she had planned for so long, was overshadowed by the knowledge that the fight for her dignity, for every black woman in her position, was far from done. She had entered a battle that would require more than her professional composure, it would require an unrelenting force of will. As she stepped outside to meet her awaiting taxi, the cool New York air hit her face, sharp and invigorating. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze clear her mind. The skyline of Manhattan loomed in the distance, the city bustling with its usual energy. The city that never slept was about to become her battleground. She wasn't just going to let this incident fade away. It wasn't just a matter of securing her first-class seat, it was about standing up for what was right, and pushing back against a system that had perpetuated discrimination for far too long. The drive through the city was a blur. As her taxi weaved through the busy streets, her mind raced with thoughts of the next steps she would take. She knew that this would not be an easy road. There would be pushback, resistance, and obstacles at every turn. But Amelia had faced adversity before, she was no stranger to overcoming hurdles. This was just another challenge, and she was ready to meet it head-on. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She fished it out and unlocked the screen. The email notification from the airline's customer service department popped up, and she opened it quickly, her heart racing. "Dear Captain Hayes," it began, "thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. We deeply regret the inconvenience you experienced and apologize for the confusion with your seating assignment. We are currently reviewing the situation and will reach out to you with a more detailed response shortly." Amelia read the email twice, frustration mounting. They hadn't even addressed the core issue. Why was she treated differently in the first place? Why had her seat been reassigned in a way that felt deliberate, with no regard for her qualifications or dignity as a passenger? She felt a wave of indignation. The apology felt hollow, a mere attempt to placate her. She had to push further, take this to a higher level. The fight she had started in that plane wasn't going to be solved with a simple corporate apology. By the time the taxi pulled up to her family's home, the sun had begun to set, casting a soft golden hue across the streets. Amelia stepped out, inhaling the comforting scent of her childhood neighborhood. This was her refuge, her sanctuary. But even here, her mind refused to quiet. Her parents and younger brother would expect a joyous reunion, but Amelia knew she couldn't fully escape the battle that was unfolding in her mind. She was greeted warmly at the door by her mother, a woman who had always been a rock of support, her father's deep voice calling out from the kitchen. But even as she wrapped her arms around her mother, the weight of what had happened was still there, like a shadow that clung to her. She hadn't told them about the incident yet, knowing it would only bring more stress to their already busy lives. For now, she would focus on being present. She needed this time with her family. Dinner was a joyful affair, the smell of her mother's cooking filling the house and providing some comfort. Her younger brother, Marcus, joked and laughed, and her father told stories from his younger years, stories that always managed to make her smile. But as the evening wore on, her parents noticed the subtle shift in her mood. Amelia was distant, her mind occupied elsewhere. Her mother, ever perceptive, gave her a knowing look and leaned in as they cleared the table together. "Is everything all right, Amelia?" her mother asked softly, her voice filled with concern. Amelia hesitated. She had planned to tell them about the incident. After all, her parents were the ones who had raised her to fight against injustice. But there was a part of her that didn't want to burden them, a part that wanted to protect them from the weight of it all. But she knew they would see through the act. She took a deep breath, meeting her mother's gaze. "I had an incident at the airport today," she began, her voice steady. "Something that I thought was over, but it's not." Her mother's brow furrowed with concern. "What happened, sweetheart?" Amelia sighed, recounting the entire situation, the reassignment of her seat, the treatment she had received, the cold dismissal by the supervisor. As she spoke, her voice trembled with emotion, the weight of the situation finally crashing down on her. The injustice of it, the humiliation, the stark realization that even after everything she had achieved, she could still be reduced to nothing more than her skin color. She could feel her mother's hand on her shoulder, a gentle, steadying presence. "Amelia, I'm so sorry," her mother said softly, her eyes filled with compassion. "That should never have happened. But I know you, and I know you won't let this go." Her words were like a balm to Amelia's weary soul. It wasn't easy, but her mother's unwavering belief in her gave her the strength to continue. She had been taught, from a young age, to stand up for what was right, no matter the consequences. And now, more than ever, that lesson rang true. The next morning, Amelia woke early, her mind racing once again. She had no intention of letting this issue fade into the background. Her family had given her the support she needed to push forward, but the real work was just beginning. She spent the morning drafting a formal letter to the airline's upper management. In it, she outlined not just the events of the day before, but the broader implications of what had happened. This wasn't just about one woman being denied her seat, it was about the systemic inequality that still pervaded the airline industry and society at large. She knew this letter wouldn't be enough. She would need to escalate it further, perhaps even involve the media, to shine a light on the issues that continued to be swept under the rug. Amelia was no stranger to the fight. But this time, her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for everyone who had ever been denied their worth, dismissed because of their gender or race. She was determined to make sure that this moment, this battle, didn't go unnoticed. By the time she finished the letter, the day was well underway. She hit send, the words flying into the ether, but the determination behind them grounded her. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew there would be obstacles and setbacks. But Amelia had always believed in the power of a voice, her voice, and now, she was going to make sure that it was heard. The unseen fight. The days that followed Amelia's return to New York felt like a blur, each morning filled with the anticipation of receiving some kind of response from the airline, and each evening marked by the quiet disappointment of silence. The rest of the world seemed to move on. People boarded flights, attended meetings, and lived their lives, seemingly unaware of the battle unfolding behind the scenes. But for Amelia, this was far from over. Every new day brought with it the weight of a purpose she could not ignore. Her phone had buzzed with a few follow-up emails from the airline, but none of them had satisfied her. They were polite, generic responses, a quick acknowledgement of the situation but with no real commitment to change. It became clear that they were hoping she would just fade into the background, quietly accepting the apology, brushing the incident under the rug. But that wasn't who Amelia was. The more she thought about it, the more resolute she became. This wasn't just about a single incident, about one flight attendant. This was about years of systemic injustice, an industry, and a society, where people of color and women were still expected to stay in their place, no matter how high they soared in the professional world. Amelia had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to allow this incident to pass without demanding change. She had become more than just a passenger on that flight, she had become a voice, a symbol for all those who had been overlooked, silenced, and diminished. But Amelia knew that change wouldn't come easily. It would take more than an email, more than a letter. It would take action, real, visible action. And it would take courage. Amelia's determination led her to start researching everything she could about discrimination in the airline industry. She read stories about other pilots, particularly black women, who had faced similar hurdles. There were reports of female pilots being assigned menial tasks based solely on their gender, of black pilots being forced to prove their competence time and again. But she also found stories of incredible strength and triumph, women and men who had risen above the systemic biases to become captains, trainers, and leaders within the industry. Her mind turned to a former colleague, Captain Diane Williams, one of the first black female pilots to command a commercial flight for a major airline. Diane had faced down challenges throughout her career, from racial profiling at airports to being overlooked for promotions in favor of less qualified candidates. Amelia knew Diane well. She had been a mentor to her in her early years of flight training. If anyone could help her navigate the political intricacies of taking on the airline industry, it was Diane. Amelia picked up the phone and dialed her number. The phone rang several times before Diane's voice greeted her warmly, despite the long absence between them. "Amelia, how's the sky treating you these days?" Diane asked, her voice light and friendly. Amelia smiled, but the weight of the situation loomed over her. "Actually, Diane, I need your advice on something. It's about an incident that happened recently, something that's been weighing on me." She went on to recount the details of the flight, the seat reassignment, the supervisor's dismissive response. Diane listened attentively, offering only small interjections when necessary, but the silence between them spoke volumes. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Amelia," Diane finally said. "But I have to tell you, I'm not surprised. This is something we've all faced in one way or another." Amelia felt her stomach twist as she heard the resignation in Diane's voice. She had known that these kinds of discriminatory practices were common, but hearing it from someone she respected, someone who had been in the trenches longer than Amelia, made it feel more real, more pervasive. "I don't want to let it slide, Diane," Amelia said, her voice steady but firm. "I can't just accept the corporate apology and move on. I need to make them understand that this isn't just a matter of a seat or a misplaced assignment. This is about respect, about recognizing me for the professional I am, not just my gender or the color of my skin." Diane was quiet for a moment. Amelia could hear the weight of the decision in her voice when she finally responded. "I understand, Amelia. And I'll help you, but you have to be ready. This isn't going to be easy. You'll be going up against more than just a few gate agents and supervisors. You'll be challenging an entire system. There will be people who try to silence you, to make you feel like you don't belong, like you're making a big deal out of nothing. But if you're serious about this, we can fight back. We've got a lot of people in our corner." Amelia nodded, even though she knew Diane couldn't see it. "I'm ready. I won't let this go." The conversation with Diane sparked a new fire inside Amelia. She wasn't just a passenger anymore, she was a leader, a change-maker. It was time to take her fight to the next level. The following week, Amelia began making phone calls, reaching out to various advocacy groups that focused on racial and gender equality in the workplace. She contacted organizations dedicated to supporting black pilots and women in aviation, seeking out the expertise and advice she needed to escalate the situation. The responses she received were overwhelming. Dozens of organizations, activists, and even former pilots offered their support. Many shared their own stories of similar discrimination, and several suggested they could help amplify her voice, taking the issue to the media, to social platforms, and even to regulatory bodies. One organization, Women in Aviation International, was particularly supportive. The nonprofit had been working for years to promote gender equality in the aviation industry and had extensive experience in handling cases like Amelia's. After reviewing the details of her experience, they agreed to stand with her, providing legal and media resources to help her pursue her case. With their help, Amelia began preparing for the next phase of her journey. She would submit formal complaints to the airline and file grievances with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC. She knew she would face backlash, but the resolve in her heart was unshakable. It was time for change. As Amelia prepared for the long fight ahead, she realized that the issue went beyond the confines of one airline or even the aviation industry. It was a microcosm of a larger issue, one that existed across every sector and every corner of society. This was about breaking down the systemic structures that had been in place for centuries, the biases and prejudices that had remained ingrained in every system of power. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the next generation of pilots, for women and people of color who still faced these challenges every day. The moment Amelia knew she couldn't turn back came when she saw the email from the airline's public relations department. It was a request for a formal interview. They wanted her side of the story for a public statement. Amelia looked at the screen, her heart racing. She had expected this moment, expected the airline to take this as an opportunity to make themselves look good in the media. But now, it was on her terms. The questions they asked in the interview wouldn't just be about the incident on Flight 2457. They would be about every instance of discrimination that still lurked in the shadows, every black woman and woman of color who had been made to feel small. She had been silent for far too long. And now, Amelia Hayes was ready to speak. The weight of change. Amelia woke early the next morning, feeling the same weight of determination that had been building within her for weeks. The interview was scheduled for noon. She had spent the last few days preparing, practicing her responses, and mentally preparing for what she knew would be an intense conversation. But more than anything, Amelia was ready to make her voice heard, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel like they didn't belong. The airline's public relations team had been persistent in their requests. They wanted to present her side of the story to the media as soon as possible. They had apologized for the incident, an apology that had been hollow in its delivery, and now, they wanted to move on. But Amelia knew that this wasn't just about her own personal frustration, it was a call for broader change. The airline, like many others, was blind to how deep the issue ran. She wasn't going to allow them to simply smooth things over and sweep it under the rug. As she sat at her kitchen table, sipping her coffee, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Diane. "Are you ready for this?" Diane's voice crackled through the speaker. Amelia hesitated, the nerves creeping in despite her resolve. "I think so. But I know this is going to be harder than I thought. I've been thinking about what this means, not just for me, but for the people who've been affected by this for years. How do we even begin to change something this big?" Diane's tone was unwavering. "You've already started, Amelia. By stepping up and saying something, by making this public, you're already putting a spotlight on something that's been kept in the dark for far too long. Change never comes easy. It starts with one voice, and you're giving people the courage to raise their own. You don't have to do it all at once, but you're setting the foundation for something bigger." Amelia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her friend's words. "You're right. I can't fix everything in one interview, but I can make sure this isn't just brushed aside. This is bigger than me. It's about every woman, every black person, who's faced the same kind of treatment, in any industry, any space. I'm ready." After hanging up with Diane, Amelia took another deep breath, then made her way to the living room where her laptop sat, waiting for her to face the moment that had been building for weeks. The PR team had sent a list of questions they intended to ask during the interview. They were trying to control the narrative, of course. They wanted to focus on damage control, offering Amelia a chance to explain the misunderstanding. But Amelia wasn't interested in playing their game. She knew what her answers would be, and they would not be framed in the way the airline hoped. Her thoughts lingered on the bigger picture. This wasn't simply a matter of one individual being mistreated, it was about the systemic nature of exclusion and inequality in industries all over the world. Amelia wasn't just fighting for a seat in first class, she was fighting for visibility, respect, and equal treatment for everyone who had been forced to prove themselves over and over again, simply because of their skin color or gender. She was fighting for the future. By the time the interview began, Amelia had mentally prepared herself. The PR agent leading the interview, a polished professional named Claire, greeted her warmly on the video call. Amelia offered a polite but firm smile, maintaining her poise despite the growing tension in her chest. "Captain Hayes," Claire began, her tone measured, "we're so grateful that you're willing to speak with us today. We understand that your experience on Flight 2457 was frustrating, and we'd like to take the time to fully understand what happened from your perspective." Amelia nodded, but she knew where this conversation was headed. She could feel the weight of their agenda pressing in from all sides, their attempts to downplay the incident. But she would not be distracted. "I appreciate you reaching out," Amelia began, her voice steady. "But the frustration isn't about a mistake. It's about a pattern. This wasn't a one-time issue or some random oversight. What happened to me is a reflection of a larger issue within the aviation industry, and it goes far beyond just one flight or one seat." Claire's eyes flickered with surprise, but she quickly recovered. "Could you elaborate on that, Captain Hayes? What do you mean by a larger issue?" Amelia didn't hesitate. "I mean that women of color, particularly black women, are constantly overlooked and undervalued, not just in the aviation industry, but in many fields. My experience wasn't an isolated incident, it's part of a broader culture of discrimination and exclusion. It's the kind of culture that makes people like me feel like we have to prove ourselves over and over again, even when we've earned our place. This isn't just about the incident with the seat, it's about how I was treated, dismissed, and made to feel like I wasn't entitled to the same privileges as any other passenger." Claire opened her mouth to respond, but Amelia cut her off. She had a point to make, and she wasn't going to let anyone stop her. "You can't just apologize and move on," she continued. "This is a pattern that's ingrained in the industry. You want to make it seem like a mistake was made, but this isn't about a mistake. It's about a system that repeatedly devalues black women and women of color in this field. You can tell me I'm welcome, you can tell me you're sorry, but until you address the systemic issues, this will keep happening. And it won't just be me. It will be the next woman, and the next, and the next." For a moment, Claire was silent, clearly caught off guard by Amelia's boldness. Amelia could feel the tension thickening in the air, but she pressed on, speaking with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I've spent years working hard to get where I am. I've faced challenges and obstacles that most people will never understand. And I've earned my seat, both in the cockpit and as a passenger. The color of my skin, the fact that I'm a woman, it should never be a factor in how I'm treated. But it is. And I won't stop speaking out until it changes." The silence in the room was palpable. Claire blinked several times, her expression unreadable as she processed the weight of Amelia's words. Finally, she spoke, though it was clear she was struggling to regain control of the conversation. "We're committed to reviewing the situation and making sure that something like this doesn't happen again," she said, her tone less assured than before. "We appreciate your feedback, Captain Hayes." Amelia knew better than to trust that hollow promise. She had heard it too many times before. But she wasn't speaking for their satisfaction. She wasn't speaking to make them feel better about themselves. She was speaking to expose the truth and, in doing so, lay the foundation for real change. "I'll be watching," she said, her voice unwavering. "And I'll be speaking out. Because this is far from over." As the call ended, Amelia sat back in her chair, her chest heaving as she took in the weight of everything she had just said. It had been hard, but it was necessary. And while she didn't expect an immediate resolution, she knew that her voice had made a difference. The real battle was just beginning, but Amelia had taken the first step in a fight that would span far beyond the confines of one airline or one seat. Her journey was now about much more than proving a point. It was about ensuring that every woman who followed in her footsteps could take their seat with dignity, knowing they would never have to fight to be seen.